Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Richie Steffen. Few people have a passion for plants or an excitement about gardening more than Richie Steffen. Richie is the director curator for the Elizabeth C. Miller Botanical Garden, where he manages the garden rare plant collections and heads acquisitions of new plants. He also supervises the primary educational program of the Miller Garden, Great Plant Picks. Great Plant Picks is committed to building a comprehensive palette of outstanding and reliable plants for maritime Pacific Northwest gardens. A noted lecturer and horticultural personality, Richie, co-author and co-photographer of the Plant Lover's Guide to Ferns, which I have, and it's an excellent book, is ready to share his knowledge and make you want to plant too. And I had the pleasure of viewing Richie's presentation a few years ago, which prompted me to ask, can we please have him at the Garden Club? So I'm sure you're really going to enjoy this presentation and learn a lot. So welcome, Richie.
It's great to kind of be there, at least virtually. I really wish I could have come on up on there. I love coming up to Orcas and spending a little time. So I'll talk a lot about ferns, but really I'm approaching it from the Victorian influences that have happened over the years. And really, you know, we often don't think about Victorians having a lot of influence on the way how we garden there. And it's surprising how much influence they have on what we do in our gardens today. And a lot of the focus is going to be on shade gardening. And we do a lot of shade gardening here at the Miller Garden, and I really find it an interesting style of gardening and a lot of fun to do because it really makes you think about the principles of landscape design, you know, how things flow together, repetition, textures and forms, and because you're working a lot more with foliage, it makes you think about foliage so much more and how things relate to each other there. And so, you know, combining fine textures with bold textures and mixing your foliage together is a real art, and creating these compositions in the garden is a lot of fun. And in Victorian times, that was a concern. I mean, they really did enjoy their flowers a lot, but they also really loved bold foliage and a lot of tropicals. And you could see it in some of the older gardens in the UK. This was a garden I was in down in Cornwall, which is a very shady little pond, and you could see all that bold texture there and exciting foliage, and you don't really miss not having a lot of flowers in there at all. Here at the Miller Garden, Miller Garden is a 4-acre property where 2.5 of it is in garden, and we have a considerable amount of shade. We have about 2/3 to 3/4 of the garden in some degree of shade. We have some of it that's in natural, that's in woodlands that's been planted under, like this photo shows. And then we also have a lot of mature trees around the garden. So near the house, it's surrounded by trees. And so although we have some bright shady areas, there's definitely some heavier shaded spots. But one of the things that I think is really kind of fun about having trees around is you really start to think about canopies and layering in the garden. And so our garden has a lot of thought into the layers of the garden and what's the top canopy, what's mid canopy, and what's on the ground cover plane there. And so it's really kind of makes you think a lot more about gardening. And if you think shade garden is limited, it's really not true. You can do a lot of different textures and find a lot of different plants that really do well and add color and form to the garden. And we will hunt around for a lot of rare and unusual plants, and so there's a number of really exciting plants that do well in shade. This is actually this. I don't think this would date back to the Victorian era, but it is a branched Solomon seal, a multi-branch Solomon seal, Polygonatum multiflora, race mosissimum. They're in kind of an unusual plant, a slower grower, not quite as fast spreading, but a really interesting texture and look in the garden. And of course, we use a lot of ferns at the Miller Garden. Betty liked ferns, I love ferns. And so we're always looking for interesting and unusual ferns to add to the garden, which really, during the Victorian era, ferns were really important and they were extraordinarily popular, and so popular that during the Victorian era, there's a period called Pteridomania. And Pteridomania, roughly, it depends on who you talk roughly lasted from the 1850s to about 1910, although some accounts push it earlier into the late 1830s, and it could end. Some folks feel that it ends a little earlier, around 1890. But anyways, people were obsessed about ferns during this time, and Pteridomania was sometimes also called fern fever, and this is actually a picture that was in the Illustrated London News in July 1871. And it is a fern foray where people would get together and go out and look for ferns. And one of the reasons that fern forays were so popular is, Victorians could be a little prudish on how men and women interacted, and so and also the Victorians were very interested in the naturalistic world, and so now we go out and we'll look at wildflowers, but in the Victorian time, men and women really couldn't go out and look at wildflowers because wildflowers are the way how plants sexually reproduce. And so it was considered a little vulgar, and you just don't know what's going to happen if you have men and women out looking at wildflowers there. But ferns, they really didn't know early on in the Victorian era how ferns reproduced. And so because ferns didn't have flowers, and it was a little bit of a mystery on how they reproduced on there, it was quite safe for men and women to go out together to look for ferns, whereas it wasn't necessarily so with other types of plants. And this Pteridomania worked its way well into society. There were artworks that focused on fern foray and on fern collecting, that sort. The Fern Gatherer in 1877 there. And it also worked itself into household items. And so you could find fabrics, architecture that reflected ferns, as well as all manner of household objects and trinkets. And here, these wooden pieces that features Mauchline fernware, which was this very popular style of decorating furniture, especially wooden furniture and trinkets with various patterns, and ferns were particularly a favorite. And this was done by pressing fern fronds, laying them down on the surface of the finished wood, and then spraying a light layer of paint over it, and then layering more and more on top of it to create these very intricate and images that have a feeling of depth to them. And you can still find these available now if you take a look. Also, ferns were extraordinarily popular, a popular subject for books. During the Victorian era, you could have up to 20 books that would have been published in a year. And now we are lucky to have even one fern book published in a year. And so here's just a little brief selection of fern books that were published during the Victorian Tritamania years. There in these books were a lot of prints and plates, color images, paintings that or prints that represented various ferns, and it was a great way for people to learn about ferns. People not only did these plates and prints of ferns, they would collect them and press the fronds. And so serious collectors would create their own herbarium, which would be a collection of pressed fronds there, and it would be a recording of the plants that they grew or had in their garden there. And some of these were extremely important scientifically, and so some of the most serious collectors, their herbariums would pass from person to person there. And so this is one of the historically significant Victorian ferns, the Crawfordsburn fern, and the writing that you see down towards the bottom of this, if we look at that a little closer, so here we can see the original notes on it. Belfast, uh, um, Mr. W.H. Ferguson, 1864. So he is the person who made this herbarium specimen. And then, and this was a frond, and he wrote a book that on Irish ferns that included this fern in it. And then his collection was purchased by Thomas More. And then Thomas More's collection was purchased by Kew, and Kew has these today. This is in the Kew herbarium where I took a photo of it. And in 1966, someone at Kew assessed this herbarium specimen and wrote down that it's apparently the genuine Crawfordsburn fern found in County Down in 1861. So this frond was picked in 1864, just a few years after it was found. And then there were some notes about W.H. Ferguson's book, Ferns of Ulster. And so one of the reasons that this fern is so important is that it's kind of a precursor to this fern, Polystichum sativum plumosum multilobum group. Crawfordsburn fern is very hard to propagate and mostly done through division. It's sterile and it doesn't produce any bulblets. So it was always really difficult. But later on, the Plumosum multilobum was found, and these actually produce little bulblets or plantlets along the stem, much easier to produce. And these have been produced since Victorian times to now. You can still find these in gardens today. The Crawfordburn fern, there are only, I think, potentially 3 known plants of it that still exist. And there's some debate on whether they are really that fern or not. Nobody is really certain at the moment. So, so you can see how these Victorian plants really produce some great plants for us today. And the way how this influences us is that some of these, one is during the Victorian time was the great era of plant collecting. And so explorers in Europe would travel the world, collect plants and bring them back. And they would be in the gardens of the landed gentry, and they would preserve them and create these remarkable collections. They would also, during the Victorian era, the ferns native to Europe really became quite popular and interesting. And people on those fern forays would look for variation in something a little different. And so that led to literally thousands of cultivars being selected out, some of them excellent plants, some of them not so excellent plants. The Victorians really weren't interested in picking out necessarily pretty and vigorous plants. They were looking for something different. And so some of the Victorian cultivars are just frankly downright ugly. But some of the pretty ones made it through and are still propagated today. This is a selection of lady fern, Citidrum cristatum, and it is a crested fern, which is these little divisions along the end are crests. And if this was a little bit closer, the little leaflets inside would have this kind of frayed edge to them, which would be citigerate there. And so Citidrum cristatum described what the ferns look like, although that could vary from fern to fern. And so you can have varying degrees of that bristling and varying degrees of the cristatum, and it would still go underneath that same name. So it made sometimes cultivars a little weird and funky through Victorian times, especially today, whenever we think of cultivars as being a set thing, not variable. What I find so amazing is how many Victorian cultivars still exist today and are regularly propagated in garden with today. And so these are three examples of ferns that we could find in nurseries right now that date back to Victorian times on there. Ethereum Felix Femina Victoria, here Polystichum sativum divisilobum group here, and Asplenium scolopendrium fimbriatum group here. Sometimes they'll be listed underneath different names, but for the most part, these exist on there, and it's fairly easy. In truth, the plants being sold as Victoria aren't really Victoria. They are sporelings from Victoria. Victoria can only be propagated either through tissue culture or through divisions, and it's a very spectacular fern, but its progeny have a lot of the characteristics of the true original Victoria. And that center one, we may know better as Alaska fern, which is quite available here, and a really very tough and reliable plant. And then this hart's tongue fern, this Asplenium scolopendrium fimbriatum group, is still regularly produced, and with this wonderful kind of little bit serrated, little bit of a ruffled edge to the leaf. And we think of all these cultivars. Whenever we start looking at cultivars, so many of them date back to Europe. But yet we have some really wonderful native ferns here, but there are almost no cultivars or very few cultivars of our native ferns. And so there's only a handful that I know of our native sword fern, Polystichum unitum. This is one crispum group, a friend, one of the board members of the Hardy Fern Foundation found this and named it Tolt Twirl. There, and it has this wavy, twisted frond there, and a very kind of unique, interesting look to it. And if you sow the spore on that and grow it, a certain percentage of them will continue having that kind of what's called a crispy edge. And so those sporelings collectively we call crispum group. And here is one of the sporelings that's in crispum group on there. Now this plant only produced a few leaves that had that much twisting and curling to them, but it's still a young plant. And so I'm growing this on. This is out of my home garden. I'll be growing this on to see what it actually develops into as the plant matures. There, another interesting selection of one of our native ferns is this here. This is a lady fern. But it's our native lady fern, which the Western lady fern is Felix femina variety Cyclosaura. And the Cyclosaurus, it can get weedy for us. You don't need to hunt it out and plant it because it'll often plant itself in your garden. They can be very vigorous and they can push out other things, but there are no known cultivars of it. And the same board member who found Tolt Twirl also found this. And it's the first known cultivar crested form, the original crested plant. He named Lucy, so it'd be Cristata group Lucy. But these are sporelings from Lucy, which are also showing cresting on them and divided leaves. And so these are still quite young. These are only a few years old. So I don't know how large they'll get overall. The original plant, Lucy, will get up to 4 feet tall or so. And so hopefully these will as well. Right now, they have only gotten to about a foot to 18 inches tall. So we'll see how big they will grow, but it's exciting to see that we can find cultivars and interesting things here in our own native ferns. So, there are some ideas that were developed in Victorian times that really do have applications here in our modern gardens. They often need to be scaled down some. During the Victorian times, people were working with estates, and we don't have as many estates. And certainly the scale of gardening that happened here was quite amazing and required quite a lot of labor and quite a lot of money to do. And so, but many of the ideas they used we can scale down, and they're probably not conservatories. We won't find those in everybody's garden, but you could have greenhouses, and conservatories were very important hallmark of the Victorian age. It was a time where many conservatories were built, and heating them was much cheaper than what it is now. In there, and if you ever get a chance to go to any old conservatories, old Victorian conservatories, they're quite spectacular. And also the hardscape in the garden, really quite dramatic and quite beautiful there. But in our much smaller modern gardens, we can look at smaller projects where we can include some of the ideas that were developed in Victorian times. And one of those is ferneries and grottos. Ferneries originally were a concept for in a glass house. So they were either in a greenhouse or in a conservatory. They focused on this, and this is a shot out of one of the Victorian era fern books in the early 1900s of a fernery, but a few of them still exist now. Today, that Tatton Park has a large conservatory and a fernery wing to it, which is quite dramatic and spectacular with big tree ferns in it and very lush and vibrant. But we we can do ferneries outside as well. This is a fernery, although it looks like an old Victorian fernery. It is an area that they at Broadsworth Hall, where they knew a fernery existed at one time, but they had no pictures and no drawings of what the fernery was. And so they converted this area into a fernery with a feel and look of a Victorian era fernery there. And it's really quite beautiful and lovely, but still this is on quite a much larger scale than we have. But we could really do ferneries on a much smaller scale. This is a small fernery that I did at my old garden in Federal Way, Washington, where I used broken concrete and small ferns to do a somewhat of a concrete crevice garden. And it was in a bright, shady area, and you can do a wonderful array of ferns and other companion plants in there, saxifrags and that sort. Grottos are a bit more challenging for us, but the difference between ferneries and grottos is grottos generally are often have natural caves or dug into the ground to a certain extent. And so this is an old grotto in Wales, Dustow Gardens and Grottos. And it is amazing to see these places, very inspiring. One of the things that I found very interesting about Dusto is they did not have stone accessible. And so all of the stonework that you see in the next few images is not real stone. It's a concrete material called pulmonite, which there was a company that specialized in making stone features and building fake rock. That sort, and they did these pulmonite stones, and they're really remarkable. This whole cave system is all pulmonite and built underground there. And so you would walk through these caves, and some had streams running through them. All of this is fake stone, which is really pretty doggone remarkable on such a big scale. But and then within rooms would open up, and then you'd have your plantings within that. Here is a friend's place using some salvaged architecture from one of the buildings that was taken down in Seattle. Um, this was a grotto that was built into a hillside, and so this was dug out. Water collects in the base and is pumped up to this dish here, and then falls back down. And then ferns are placed all along the edge and surrounding it. And it's in a lightly wooded area there. So this can be incorporated into a garden if you have the right space, but it's kind of fun to see and think about that sort of thing. Stumperies have increased in popularity over the last few years. This was purely a horticultural invention of the Victorian era, and it was a direct result from areas having limited stone. They didn't have stone, but they did have access to stumps, and so they used those like stone, and they would build these structures within the garden. And there are now several stumperies within the U.S. as well, and a few really wonderful stumperies here in the Pacific Northwest. And when you look at the woodlands of the Pacific Northwest, you can see how stumperies really resonate with our region and really look very much in place in this region. This is shot up in the Cascades there, and you can see the ferns growing in the moss. Our native licorice fern on there, and very naturalistic and very pretty. This is the real stumpery out on Vashon Island. Pat Reel created it, and with her husband Walt there. And this is the entryway into it, and you can see the stumps, the stump entryway, and then using fallen logs, stumps, and all manner of branches. It's heavily planted with ferns, a few ground covers, a few rhododendrons in a woodland setting in a ravine. And so very pretty. The moss is allowed to grow, and it's a very, I find these gardens very relaxing. You know, they just are so peaceful and so relaxing, and they really uh, just merge in with the wild areas around them. Recently, Heronswood created the Renaissance Garden, which is another kind of a mixture of fernery, stumpery, a lot of old logs used within it, and old stumps, and planted heavily with ferns, ground covers, and many other funky, weird plants from Dan Hinckley's collections there. But beautiful. That right beside the Renaissance Garden is their rain wall where water flows down, and several ferns are planted in that as well. And so you can see how these just really, you know, are a very naturalistic style, and these can be done on a very miniature scale as well. The Hardy Fern Foundation has a stumpery down at the Rhododendron Species Botanical Garden in Federal Way, and I think I want to say it was built in 2009 or somewhere right around in there. And so a lot of great weathered logs, really heavily planted with ferns and rhododendrons, that sort, and really quite pretty. And I didn't have access to great stumps, but this is my old Federal Way garden, and I had a slope that I needed to deal with. And so I did have access to a lot of log rounds. And so I made my stumpery out of log rounds down the hillside, and part of it was staircases that were covered in wire netting, and then it was heavily planted with rhododendrons, hostas, ferns, all sorts of stuff. And then, of course, Victorians did do a lot of containers, and that sort of planting and use of ferns is totally legit now, and can be a fun way to really brighten up and have some dramatic flair into a shady area of the garden. This is a fern container that we did at the Miller Garden a few years ago. And then another style of containerized ferns are fern tables. Originally, the first fern table that I saw was done by George Schenk, who did it at Nancy Davison Short's house. And George was he wrote several books for Timber Press, The Shade Garden, The Moss Garden, and growing plants on pavement and hard surfaces. All three excellent books. They're out of print now, but you can get them through secondhand stores, and well worth tracking down there. And essentially, it is creating these small woodland vignettes on a flat surface, and they're really quite striking. Whenever I saw it, I was just like, I have to do that. These are a few that I made, and this is a fern table that was built on slabs of cedar log. And then this is at the Heronswood Renaissance Garden. They have a large cedar table built there that is loaded with ferns and other woodland plants. And they don't have to be complicated. Any hard flat surface will work. And so these are a few that I've seen around in my garden travels, where folks have found old metal tables and added and built on top of those, and adding wood, stone, as well as ferns and moss and other woodland plants. And even here, this is at a good friend of mine, Nancy Goldman, down in Portland. Even the sink can serve as a great fern table. And so, I did not take a peek whenever I started, but I think I still have a little bit of time. And so I put in a few of my favorite ferns to garden with. And so I'll share a few favorites on there. This is Polystichum neolevatum Asian saber fern, which would get to about 2 to 3 feet tall, depending on the site. It grows its tallest in rich, moist soil in shade. But it can take, it's not overly drought tolerant, but it will tolerate like once a week or once every other week water. It'll be a little smaller, typically about 1 to 1.5 feet tall, but very evergreen. And it has this wonderful metallic shine to the foliage. And so, in a really unique kind of a bit of depending on the form, to dark green to olive green coloring to it, but a beautiful, very tidy looking fern. And this is around, you can find this in the nurseries. It's not available all the time, but it is being produced. And I love the foliage on it. I love the new growth of it. These are the new fronds of Neolevatum coming up there, and they just look so good in the with other woodland plants there. And you can see these large kind of bright scales on the stems, and really dramatic. And this is just as they're almost fully expanded in the garden. So a really great, beautiful fern, and a good doer. The Dropterus lepidopoda, this is sometimes called sunset fern. And then new growth comes out bronzy colored, much like autumn fern does, except this has a little bit more graceful form and even shape than what autumn fern can. I mean, autumn fern is a great plant, but this has a little bit more uniform look to it. And it's great as a single specimen, or it's fine in drifts. This is a drift of them at my new garden out in Kingston there, and it's a really beautiful plant. It likes good soil and likes regular watering. So this one placed somewhere where it can be watered, and it does not like a lot of sun. So some morning sun's okay, but keep it out of the hotter afternoon sun, and it will keep a good dark green look to it and be a really beautiful plant. And this one is a kind of a new fern out. This is Polystichum dicei, Dice's holly fern, and this is a hybrid that was produced in the UK. And when ferns are crossed, they almost always produce a sterile offspring. So even though this looks like it produces a lot of spore, the spore is not viable on it. So when they did the hybridizing of it, they used one parent that had a great form, and one parent that produced little plantlets or bulbils on the fronds. And so this one, that way the offspring often would have a bulbil, so it'd be a little easier to produce. And so this does produce a bulbil, and you can see right there on the tip, you'll get between 3 to 5 little bulbils that will then develop it into plants. And it is an evergreen fern, but if these fronds touch the ground, they will root in and start a new plant. You can also clip them off and put them in soil, cover it over with a little plastic lid or something of that sort, and they will root and grow for you. But a fantastic plant. It used to be around a lot more than what it is now, but it still is around. It just takes a little bit more looking for it now. But a really great specimen plant. Also a good plant to use in drifts. And this can get up to about 3 feet tall. So it's a good size fern. And I really like some giant ferns in my garden. And so this fern has undergone a number of name changes. It's Asian ostrich fern, now Anoclea orientalis, but it used to be Matutia orientale, and then it became Pentarhizidium orientale, and now it's Anoclea orientalis. There. So the botanical name, it could be any 3 of those in the nursery, but it is and don't be scared by ostrich fern. This regular ostrich fern is an aggressive spreader. This one is not, even though it is related to the regular ostrich fern. This won't run. But it's a very large, dramatic foliage. Each one of those fronds can grow to 4 to 5 feet in length. It's a deciduous fern, but beautiful arching habit. This is a plant in my garden, and last year it stretched probably, each one of these fronds was about 4 feet in length. And this is what's called a dimorphic fern. So it produces 2 different kinds of fronds. The large fronds, which are the sterile fronds, they don't produce spore. And then you can see these brown things here. That is the fertile frond on there. And these fertile fronds become quite woody, and that's where the spore are held. And so during the winter time, when that fern dies down, you are left with these upright fertile fronds, and they're actually quite beautiful. I'll often leave them in the garden through the winter. They're really kind of graceful. They have a lot of movement to them. They look feathery. These can be used as in dried flower arrangements as well. Although I will warn you, if you cut these and bring them in, they can release their spore. So you can have a little dusty mess from them. They will typically hold on to their spore until spring and then release it then. Another giant fern that is absolutely remarkable is Woodwardia unigimata, single jewel chain fern. And the best forms of this have incredible red new growth. And the typical, the average size of these fronds runs roughly between 3 to 5 feet in length. But I've grown them as long as 8 feet long. So they are low arching fronds, and the fern itself grows very open, so you can grow a lot of things around and through them. And this is one of the ferns that I do not cut back until the frond actually looks terrible on there. If you whack these back in the winter, whenever the fronds are still looking green, they really resent it, and the plant can do very poorly. So only prune back fronds whenever they look like they need to be pruned back on this. And the other thing, it's called single jewel chain fern because on the very ends of these fronds, if they are happy with you, they will develop 1 or 2 large buds, and those can be pinned down to the ground, and they will root and create a new plant, and that you can either put somewhere else in your garden or you can share with friends. But a really dramatic and beautiful fern. There's a plant that's growing out of an old stump there, and you could see where these fronds have come down and they've touched down, and a new plant is starting to grow there and there and there. A couple of ground cover ferns. This is Blechnum panamarina. Blechnums, some folks want to change the names on them, so you may find it under Blechnum panamarina, but it's little hard fern or little water fern. This is only about 6 to 8 inches tall, give or take. New growth is typically either red blush to bronze color on it, and it is a slow spreading ground cover. It won't keep weeds out, but it's a really beautiful plant across the ground there. So, or it doesn't keep all the weeds out. So you still have to weed it a little bit, but it is a really lovely fern, evergreen foliage. After the new bronzy growth comes out, it turns dark green. This will do well in average soil, but it also do great in moist soils. If you from almost full shade to full sun, in sun, it must be moist. So to get the best growth out of it there. And I popped that in before a Woodwardia nijimata. There's another shot of that Woodwardia with those brilliant red and new growth coming out. And my favorite ground cover fern is Adianthum venustum, Himalayan maidenhair or evergreen maidenhair. This looks so fine and delicate, but it's actually quite a tough fern. It does run and spread, so give it the space to do that, or let it ramble around between other plants. The foliage is fully evergreen, and this does not like very moist soil. So you want a place where you water it maybe once a week. There, you don't want to keep it moist all the time. There, and I do cut this fern back on there. It starts growing very early. It's one of our first ferns to start sprouting up in late winter, and so we cut it back in mid-December. And then generally by mid to late February, we have new fronds coming up, and they have this great shrimp pink color to them. And then they open up, turn a little chartreusey, and then eventually to that bright green color. And then just a few little dwarfs, dwarf golden scale male fern, Duropteris affinis crispa gracilis, keeps to about a foot tall, very tight, very reliable, and very hardy, and a beautiful plant. They are a great small fern for pots and containers, or tucked up against the edge of a pathway. Another wonderful native fern of ours is a Splenium trichomones maidenhair spleenwort. This is drought tolerant once it gets established, and if it likes where it is, you'll actually get little sporlings of it. This whole plant is maybe the fronds grow about 6 to 8 inches tall on it, and they stay very nice, compact. It doesn't run at all, and it's a beautiful fern. It is evergreen, but it really, it rarely needs to be cut back. Sometimes I'll give it a light shearing, but most of the time I'll just let the new fronds come up through the old fronds, and the old fronds fade away in a really unnoticeable way. And you can really tuck these into spaces. It's great for a shady rockery to tuck in to the stones. And they're watered for a few years to get it settled in, but after that, they can really survive quite a bit of drought. And I put this in. This is our native maidenhair, which is wonderful fern. But one of my favorite ferns is the dwarf form of that, which is not widely available. You really have to hunt for this, and they are not easy to find. But the dwarf Western maidenhair is so doggone cute. Subhumulum, we grow it in troughs. We've grown it in the ground. It likes a little like bright open shade to grow its best, but it is just freaking adorable. Wonderful imbricated Venetian blind-like leaflets on the fronds. They're quite charming, and it's something you should look for. If you find it, just buy it. Don't look at the price tag of it. Just get it on there. And so there is a few ideas for the garden that have a little Victorian flair, and also a few of my favorite ferns for the garden.
I'm overwhelmed with all the things I want to go home and just try out and look for in nurseries.
I know it is really exciting.
Yeah. I'll start off the questions because I have one. Can you give us any recommendation for a nursery that would really be specific for ferns? Some of the rare ones that you've been talking about that are somewhat in our location.
The Hardy Fern Foundation, they do a members distribution in the early autumn, and that's really good. We're growing a lot of rarer, more unusual ferns for that. And so, if you come down, there's a plant sale that they do at Bellevue Botanic Garden in early June. And but then they do the members distribution, which is all generally our newer material every year. And I think that goes up in August, and then the shipping is in September.
I have a question about the ground cover ferns, and I wonder if they maintain themselves or do they require much maintenance?
It depends on the fern. What I would really recommend is most of those ground cover ferns, you don't have to cut them back. You don't have to cut back any fern, but it will often make them look tidier and cleaner if you do there. And so I would clip them back, and then some of them would require some water. But other than that, I mean, most of those, they don't have a lot of pests or disease related issues. And there's sometimes, early in the spring with new growth, deer can jump on them, and the same with rabbits. but as the foliage hardens off, then it is less so.
Can you move established ferns, and if so, what would be the right time of year to do that?
Yeah, you could certainly move established ferns. The best time to do that though is in fall or winter. You can move them up to March. Don't move anything, don't move them now. And once you move them, you gotta water them regularly for the first few years to get them settled back in. But it's very easy to move ferns. They will, for the most part, respond very well to it.
I am curious about any ferns to avoid. You know, when I see a Himalayan maidenhair and I think about our native maidenhairs, and it's hard to imagine ferns getting too aggressive, but are there any ferns that we should be not putting out there because of their interaction with the native flora?
Sure. You know, hardy ferns in particular are really it's really uncommon for any of the hardier ferns to escape into the wild. You know, I don't know of any here that there's some that will naturalize in your garden if you're watering it, but for the most part, you know, the hardy ferns, other hardy ferns won't escape, like the maidenhair, and it's also really rare for ferns to hybridize amongst themselves, so it doesn't occur very readily, and it, you know, for our region, it would be really extraordinarily rare. If you lived in the southeast where it's a little bit more humid and tropical, or you live in tropical areas, then there are ferns that do escape. But here, I don't think you really have to worry about it at all. There are ferns that I wouldn't grow, though. And actually a lot turn out to be our natives on there. Like lady fern is really, can be really aggressive, and it can spore into other ferns and then literally outgrow them and push them out. So I would really weed out lady ferns, the native lady fern in the garden, just because it's so aggressive. And, you know, sword ferns also spore around quite a bit. And although I think, you know, sword ferns are a fabulous garden plant, you may want to just, you know, be aware of how much they're sporing around, and occasionally, you know, remove ones where you don't want them. But otherwise, you know, you're pretty good. They're a pretty easy to care for plants, and with a very low ability to invade into our wild into native habitat.
First, thank you for that great presentation. I have a lot of ferns in my garden, and I have ones that are like brown edges on the edges of the leaves, and they don't look very good, but I'm sort of reluctant to trim them. Can you tell me what do these ferns need? Why are they getting brown on the edges?
Browning on the edges can be caused by a few different things. If you're seeing it now, it would be browning that happened last year, most likely. And the it can, you know, it is generally a sign of drought stress, especially early in the year. Whenever, you know, they're most susceptible to that, whenever the new fronds are emerging and maturing. And it is not uncommon for us in, you know, as we get into late April and May, to have some really sunny weather like this week, or into May, having some sunny hot, like just a few days of sunny hot weather. And that's all it takes, is like a day of sunny hot weather, and the plants get a little stressed, and then boom, you have browning on the fronds. And so if it's a plant that has browning, what I would do is put a little mulch on it to try to keep the water level, keep the moisture a little even on it. And I would, you know, in plants that are showing that stress, I don't cut them back uh, to remove all of that. I would leave the new growth come out, and once the new growth comes out and opens up, then I would go in and cut out um, that older, uglier fronds there, and that just helps in the transition. The green that's on those fronds right now is creating food and really helping those new fronds to grow better. So wait until your new fronds come out and then cut back those old fronds on the ones that are stressed.
Let's go to our online chat. Helen asks, are there flowers that you would recommend to accompany the ferns?
That's a good question.
But you know what I do? I do a lot of plants with my ferns. You know, there's some great things like Rogersia. You know, well, if it's a brighter area, I will often add in hostas, but I feel like, you know, if it's too shady, the hostas won't do well. On there, I've added a number of different ground covers with it, like the native ginger does really well with it. I will often mix them with rhododendrons. Epimediums are a great companion for them. I uh, I will often plant some of the spring ephemerals that come and go in where the ferns are, because by the time the ferns really pop up and start to fill out the area, those spring ephemerals are starting to die down. In the area, Solomon seal is another good companion with the ferns. And see, what else do I have? I have little hepaticas. All of those little trilliums are another great thing to work with them. So there's quite a bit that they will grow well with.
Once again, thank you for being with us virtually this morning.
Sure, my pleasure. Good to see you all.